Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about revolution. Okay, so typically when we hear revolution, we kind of it kind of comes with a negative connotation, right? We hear revolution and we think chaos, right? We think anarchy, we think violence. So I'm going to kind of give you a different picture about what revolution actually is. Okay, so if we think about a national revolution, for example, national revolution kind of implies perhaps a collapse of that nation. Now, if we zoom out though and first kind of think about why a nation develops in the first place, well, nations develop because people have common interests and they want to work together to serve those interests, right? It's pretty simple. So, on a small scale, a nation is just a tribe ultimately. If a tribe develops, families come together to serve their interests, right? Maybe they're sick and tired of fighting all the time, and instead they decide, oh, you guys know how to are really good at growing corn, and we're really good at growing pumpkins, so let's work together and we can provide each other corn and pumpkins, right? This is how nations develop. Now, obviously, the tribe example is a smaller scale nation, but on a grander scale, this is how nations develop. You get these large geographic areas with large amounts of people that come together and say, we're going to start a nation in order to serve interests, right? We all have diverse, unique skills, and we're going to use those skills and we're going to trade things that we create, right? And ultimately, what this means, again, is that nations develop to serve the interests of the collective. So, how is it then that a revolution can develop, a national revolution? Well, it happens because one way or another, people stop serving each other's interests. In other words, the mutual interests that we were helping each other towards are have kind of been usurped by individualistic interests. Okay, by individualism, we could say. And what that ends up doing is creating competition. And when the competition gets too high, you ultimately stop serving each other's interests. And in fact, you end up serving your own interests, perhaps at the expense of somebody else. So, national revolution is not a destruction of the ability to serve each other's interests. It is an expression of a failure to serve each other's interests. So, when national revolutions occur, it's not in order to create chaos. It's to bring order back into a system, into a nation that lost itself, right? So national revolutions, again, we think of them as chaotic or anarchist, but they are really returning the power back to the people, is what they're doing. And where did that power go? Well, some people would say it went to a bunch of billionaires or a bunch of globalists, for example. And there can be some truth to that. But in reality, by and large, where that power went was towards individualism and towards competition. And more broadly, where that power went was kind of towards this uh, overarching idea of nation, of national identity above the values that created that nation in the first place, right? So people will defend their national identity without realizing that the nation itself is no longer serving its interests because of the level of competition and individualism within that nation. So, what I mean to say is that when revolution occurs, when a national revolution, for example, occurs, it is to bring the power back to the people, to serve the interests of the people, rather than to serve the interests of the idea of a national identity. We become so attached to the idea of the national identity that we deprioritize the interests of the people within that nation, okay? So, in other words, nations die so that people can live. Revolutions, national revolutions occur so that people can survive. The idea of the nation is never more important than the lives of the people within that nation. So embrace revolution. Now, I'm not saying embrace violent revolution, okay? Because the truth is that revolutions occur, national revolutions occur when violence becomes a reality. Well, okay, so we see violence rise and rise and rise. We see violence outwardly rise. For example, in the United States, we have 800 military bases around the world. We're kind of acting as the world's police in a sense, because we're so afraid of everything, of everyone else, that we fund this giant military industrial complex. And before long, we're so afraid of everything, and this military industrial complex is absorbing so many resources that we are no longer serving the interests of the nation. So a revolution in the United States isn't an expression of violence, and it's actually an expression of peace. It is basically bringing awareness to the violence that has been building for decades, right? The violence is already here, and so far we've been kind of putting that violence onto other countries in the Middle East, for example. But that's going to change. That violence is going to turn inward, and it is ultimately. And it's going to continue to do that until we realize that the national identity is not the priority. The priority is the interests of the masses. Nations either serve the interests of the masses or the interests of the few. And the more consistently they serve the interests of the few at the expense of the masses, the closer you get to a revolution, the closer you get to a collapse of a nation. In 50 years, the United States, the land that is the United States, might not be called the United States anymore. I can't really tell you, but maybe we kind of split up into separate states, sort of like the European Union, where we have a separate, separate laws and separate political structures that kind of cooperate just because of the geographic contingents of the United States, or the geographic nature of the United States. Maybe we split up into separate territories that are bigger than states, or even smaller than states. But bottom line is, in 50 years again, the United States might not be a nation anymore. And that doesn't mean that we're just going to kill each other. What it might mean is prosperity. What it might mean is equality. What it might mean is a higher standard of living. It might mean thriving. What we have to realize, though, is that revolutionary acts aren't always violent. And in fact, they are often in response to violence. We have to become aware of the violence that has already been here for several decades and realize that the revolution has been occurring because fear has taken over the national identity. We are so afraid of other countries or other political parties or of other religions that we've kind of become this military machine that has been inflicting violence all over the world. And again, that violence eventually turns inward because the people who are funding that violence can't sustain their own livelihood. So again, one more time, embrace revolution. Don't embrace violence. There's peaceful revolutions. And again, when nations collapse, it is so that the people within those nations can survive. Okay, so thanks for watching.